So, welcome to everybody who is tuning in to listen to us now. You may be familiar that I often refer to the world as your classroom, being an important part of my perspective on children's education. For most of us, it doesn't really go much further than finding some snails outside the front door, or maybe what's going on down at the local park. But for some people, it really is. The world is their classroom. And today I am thrilled to welcome Andrew. Thank you so much for joining us, Andrew. Looking forward to hearing about you.
Thanks, Christine. Look forward to talk to you also about our sort of journey through life.
So how do we come to be here? I know you have been in schools proper and you have homeschooled also, so it's a bit of a mixed bag. And why don't you just take us briefly through what your overview of your family's education looks like?
Okay, so I'm an Australian, as you pick up from the accent. We currently live in Portugal. I'm married with three beautiful young kids. They're currently aged 21, 19, and 16, all about to go through sort of birthday season, if you like. And I guess sort of recognizing that this is a homeschooling podcast or a topic around homeschooling, we're not necessarily a homeschooling family. In fact, we just went through life and educated our kids in the best way we thought possible. But I'm now part of some communities of which you're aware of, some of which you're aware of, which sort of, I guess, pigeonhole different approaches to education. And as we pigeonhole those, I guess we fit into the somewhere between world schooling, sort of international, third culture kids was a term that was sort of thrown around for a while, and some homeschooling. So what does that look like, I guess? We left Australia about 12 years ago. Let's actually go further back than that. Our kids started in sort of a preschooling type of arrangement in Brisbane, I guess in 2004-5, something like that. And in the subsequent 18 odd years, we've been through, I'm looking here, I actually wrote down some notes, 7 cities, 5 countries, 10 different schools, and 5 different schooling systems around the world. So we sort of bounced from sort of as the kids evolved and grew up, and again, their age differences are about 2 years and then about 3 years between the 3 kids. So started in Brisbane, then to Sydney, then to Hong Kong, then to Bali, Indonesia, then to Europe, where we did a stint of sort of traveling and homeschooling for a year, then to Barcelona, where we tried 2 different schools. We're currently in Porto, Portugal, where we've been to sort of 2 different schools, and the kids have 2 of 3 sort of graduated through the homeschooling system. So I guess we can delve into any or all of that as you like.
Great. I think it's important to recognize that there isn't like a normal way to educate your kids or to homeschool. We have so many who start at the beginning and go all the way through, and then we have a huge chunk of homeschoolers who come into it partway through for whatever reason, and then may leave it for whatever reason. And I don't think there's any such thing as a correct way, to go about it. So, but what I think I'm also hearing is that you and your wife have assessed where you've been in each situation, and in some cases, school was the right thing to do, and in other cases, you looked around for other options. Would that be a fair comment?
Oh, look, we made choices. We made choices along the way that we thought were in the best interest of the kids at each stage, and that also married our own sort of family needs and requirements at the time. So I ran an international business. So we started that business in Australia, and it very quickly evolved to being a multinational company, and multinational in the sense that we owned operations in multiple different countries. When we left Australia, so sort of pre-departure of Australia, as I say, about 12 years ago, I was doing a lot of international travel. And so mum became full-time mum, and that was something that she chose to do, and she really loved and sort of adored the process of both being a mum for young kids and then being a sort of a mum for school-aged children. So in other words, school was a component of their education, but mum was a much bigger component of that through the early years, right through to today, I should say. So I was sort of bouncing around, traveling a lot. Then we all left as a family, took an opportunity that presented us to Hong Kong, where we set up the head office of our business. And I continued to travel. And so we made choices that we thought were in the best interest of the kids and in the best interest of us as a family in that move. Again, for all sorts of reasons, we packed up and moved ourselves to Indonesia, again, mostly business related. So again, we made decisions that we thought were in the best interest of the kids at the time. And so at each decision-making process, we said, well, what do we need to do from a family, or what's the driving motivator, I guess? And that was typically business, sort of a growing business. Secondly was, how do we ensure that the kids sort of both enjoy the process and don't resent the process? So one of the things that we did from the very, very early stages was include our kids in all the decision-making process. So we never enforced kids. I guess we enforced on them that we were moving somewhere, but they were very much part of the process. So sort of a good 6 months before we'd go anywhere, we would take them to the where. We would start doing the research on the country. One of the criticisms we have as parents on ourselves is that we never holidayed. We always went looking for somewhere to live whenever we traveled. And so the kids were very much part of the process. And so that process would literally look like we'd go to country A. So let's look at Hong Kong. We were in fact moving to Singapore 6 months before we moved to Hong Kong. So we'd gone to Singapore. We visited where we would likely live. So we had a sort of a framework of the suburb and the type of housing arrangement. So we'd go and look at houses with the kids, and they'd be part of the inspection process. We visited schools with the kids. We went to the sort of sports centres and the gyms and the sort of activities that the kids were involved in with the kids. We holidayed nearby. So again, I was working in Indonesia at the time. So we travelled across from Singapore to Indonesia. We did that whole trip. We did 2 of those trips with the kids. One of them was, I think, nearly a month, sort of bouncing around. And we came back from that trip and said, you know what, it's not right. It's not for us. And so we went back to our original plan, which was Hong Kong, and we redid that whole trip in Hong Kong for about 4 or 5 weeks, replicated it all. And then so that was in May, I guess, of 2011. March, no, it wasn't. It was in sort of February 2011. So then 3 months later, we packed up and moved. So when we got to Hong Kong, the kids knew all of this stuff. They knew their school. They'd been there. In fact, I think we'd had them in the school for a half day sort of trial session. So they knew other kids. They'd been part of a program, which was a sort of a buddy program. So they had somebody who sort of picked them up at the doorstep, so to speak, and took them off to school. We had a social group. We knew the rugby club that our son was going to play rugby in. We knew the dance troupe and so on and so on. So it was always very much about ensuring that the kids were part of the process and part of the decision-making process, regardless of how much choice they actually got, but they were very much part of the process. And so that was important for us right through that journey. And it's happened all the way along. Every decision we made, every move we made, the kids are very much part of that journey.
I think that's a really wise thing to do. And I'm pleased you've spent a while explaining how you did it. Because I note that you and your wife, you made the executive decision that you were going, but from there on in, the children were part of it. And I mean, obviously that creates that sense of having helped to make the decision, that sense of belonging and ownership over it. I think that was a really wise thing you and your wife did there. So yeah, good thing to note.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so I'm thinking, so when you were on the road there and not actually settled as such, I just know there's going to be questions like, well, what did you do for maths? What did you do for reading during those times before they were in the school in Hong Kong? Then you went to Indonesia, but didn't settle in there. So there's a bit of toing and froing. How did you and your wife handle the bookwork over that period?
Well, let me sort of go back and I'll sort of walk you through the journey, if you like, from
Sure.
sort of school to school. So again, we started in a very traditional context. So let me actually sort of backtrack even further. My wife's a primary teacher by education. So she'd sort of done a couple of degrees, did some nursing and did some psychology, and ended up at teaching, which she loved. And we were up in northern New South Wales. So she was sort of doing work experience and then got a job at some sort of reasonably small country town schools, which she really loved. So she sort of brought that approach in. So very much from the traditional sort of educator's perspective. Now we're talking late 90s, early 2000s. So I think the world was a very different place, sort of 2 generations or a generation and a half ago than where we are today. Far more innocent, but sort of looking back, there's a lot of the trends that are not positive, the less than positive trends that we're experiencing today. When we look back and reflect in that late 90s, early 2000s, we could see them poking their heads in, actually, as we look back and reflect. So, as I say, kids born 2002, 4 and 7. So those early few years, we decided to put them into daycare. Now that, again, mum was a stay-at-home mum. She was a dedicated mum and dedicated sort of educator. So the preschool slash kindy was a decision around socializing. The kids were very social kids, and I think we just moved prior. So again, our moving for the kids through school came as part of moving with my wife and I. We haven't stopped still for the entirety of our marriage, to be honest. So I think we just moved, and we figured, well, the best way to socialise both ourselves and the kids was to get involved in a sort of a kindy. So we looked at kindies that were play-based. So that was a very important part for us. So the very early days was, how do we get the kids to sort of hang around and play with other kids and be as social as possible? So that was the sort of kindy stage. The early schools were both Catholic schools. We just felt as though we didn't really want to dive into the whole private school education system. My wife had worked in the New South Wales public and sort of touched on the Queensland public education, which we didn't feel particularly great confidence. So we dived into the Catholic system. We were reasonably happy. A fun story. I remember our daughter coming home from the first day of her preschool, telling us that she was so excited because she learned to write the letter 1, and we said, show us how to do it. And she got the pencil and drew a line. And so that was a bit concerning for us. At a day at school, she'd sort of learned to draw a line, and that was the letter 1. But so those early years were sort of preschool Catholic education, sort of fitting into the system and being quite content. The same sort of daughter, actually, when we moved from Brisbane to Sydney, I can't remember, she went from grade 3 into grade 4, for example, and the education systems weren't aligned at the time. And so the Queensland kids were effectively on a numerical basis of school years, were an academic year behind. And so when we moved to Sydney, she went into the academic year that was correct for her age. And after the first day, the teacher of her year group, year 3, for example, went to the headmaster and said, this kid isn't suitable. She's got to sort of go backwards a year because she's come from Queensland effectively. So that was a really interesting time for us to sort of recognise this sort of informal rules-based system that everyone has to conform to fit in. So sort of this numerical system of grade 4, for example, everyone must sort of tick a few boxes. We found it frustrating, and we pushed and kicked and screamed on the basis of we didn't want our then 7 or 8 or 9-year-old daughter having to graduate as a 19-year-old. And we forced the school. We said, no, you take the effort, we'll take the effort to ensure that she catches up. You don't need a year in a lower grade just to simply to get her to meet the requirements of the grade. So we worked together, and long story short, my daughter passed with flying colours for that year. But we're very much in the system. So that was Sydney. We moved up to Hong Kong. That was to an international school in Hong Kong. It was all of these systems were the Australian system up until then, so the Australian education system. And Hong Kong was a very much international expat community. I mean, we were essentially surrounded with sort of banking and banking service sector parents, and all of their kids were sort of this third culture kid was where the term came up, and they were all, what do we call them, helicopter parents, or tiger parents, or all this sort of super. Have you heard of those terms?
Oh, yes, especially third culture kids. Yeah.
Well, again, the tiger mum of Asia sort of really came into force. These are the sort of super, like, career woman, really really ambitious for themselves, and that ambition throws into the kids. And so the kids are doing sort of before school in the morning, sort of tutoring, after school, and they're going from sort of sports lessons to music lessons to homework at 10 o'clock at night. So this really ambitious sort of culture, and everyone's part of a club. If you've ever had time in Hong Kong, it's a very, very interesting sort of expose into the sort of this sort of ambitious win at all cost lifestyle. We didn't fit in, quite literally. I mean, we found a few good friends, but as a broad generalization, that Hong Kong culture was really, really an aggressive culture. And as I say, you belong to clubs. The first sort of sentences in a social context when you met people was, where do you work? The bigger the bank, the sort of better the profile. Where do you live? And everyone lived in sort of building complexes. So the bigger the name building complex, the more points you got. So this was the life in Hong Kong. So the kids sort of got really exposed to this really, I would call, unhealthy lifestyle of, nannies. Kids being brought up absolutely by nannies. So the nannies get the kids up for school, they get them ready for school, they pack their lunch, they take them off to the bus, and they pick them up off the bus and then run them around to all these activities. And the helicopter parents fly in when they have time to sort of rah-rah their kids at the sporting events and then take off again. So, that was a real challenge. So we chose not to have a nanny quite purposely. We said, no, we're not going to do this lifestyle. We chose not to join a club. We chose to sort of vocally say, no, we're not part of a club, and no, we don't live in one of the prestigious buildings, and no, we don't have a nanny, and no, we don't have a Ferrari. And I mean, it was really, really quite an astounding experience. So the kids, that was a challenging process for them to sort of be associated with this culture, but parents saying, no, it's an unhealthy culture. But that said, we had a lovely time. We loved Hong Kong. Fantastic. Wonderful city to live in. We did a lot of hiking, a lot of beaching, a lot of sort of boating, a lot of activities that you wouldn't normally associate with Hong Kong. So thoroughly enjoyed it. We then moved to to Bali, which all of our social network in Hong Kong thought we were crazy. Why would we go to Bali? There was a school there called the Green School, and the Green School is a very alternate school, and it has a very strong reputation for sort of alternative schooling. Again, we chose not to go to that school and went to another school, which was called the Canggu International School. I think that was what it was called. No, sorry, it was called the Canggu Community School, CCS. And it was a wonderful school. So it followed a multidiscipline curriculum. So it had no fixed and firm curriculum. It took pieces of the Australian curriculum, pieces of the IGCSEs out of the UK, and ultimately you graduated, I think, with either an A level from the UK or an international baccalaureate. But in the younger years, it really brought in a lot of learning from the local community. So there was a lot of community activity work. There was a lot of sort of learning through doing, a lot of group work, project work. And what we found was that the kids very, very quickly moved from this sort of intense academic sort of win at all costs lifestyle in Hong Kong to this very much coming home and sharing with us their experiences of what they did, what they learned, who they were hanging out with, where they went. So it shifted from sort of what they learned and the grades they were getting into the experiences they were having. And so this is where my personal utter sort of disdain and skepticism of the education system really came to the fore. Prior to this, and so we're talking 8 or 9 years ago, so the kids were probably 10, 11, they were probably, our two eldest were probably 8, 9 was the middle child, 10, 11 was the eldest, and sort of 5, 6, 7 was the youngest, plus or minus in that sort of time frame. Prior to that, I'd been very agnostic about education. It was sort of stick them into school, the system will look after them, and I didn't care. Mum was much more focused on being engaged in their education. So she was an active parent, I was a passive parent. The Bali, the juxtaposition between what we saw in Hong Kong and what we saw in Bali really ignited me personally to say, wow, there's a problem here, because the system is designed to sort of fill these young heads with as much content as possible, i.e. the Australian system and the sort of Hong Kong structure. versus the Bali system was far less content-based and far more sort of learn through doing and experiential based. And so I really started to question, what's the motives of schooling and education? So we had 2 years there in Bali for all sorts of reasons. Again, a lot of business related. We said we're going to move to Europe, and we chose to pull the kids out of school and homeschool them for a school year. And so that was a difficult decision. So a bit like moving from Hong Kong to Bali, where our social network said, "You're crazy. What's wrong with you?" Sort of a portion of our social network in Bali said, "Homeschooling. You're crazy. What's wrong with you?" Another portion said, sort of, "Good luck. It sounds amazing," and off you go. But what's interesting about that decision was it was driven almost exclusively by the kids. Our two eldest daughters came to us and said, "We want to go to Europe. We want to sort of travel and live and homeschool and what have you." And so they sort of pitched the idea, well, the way we make this work is to travel and homeschool. So after, again, I talked about engaging the kids sort of drove the process, mum and dad, a little bit sort of backseatish. We came up with a plan, and so we moved to Europe. I think we moved at the end of, we were already in a northern hemisphere schooling year, so we transitioned from Hong Kong to Bali. I think, in fact, even Hong Kong may have been, I can't remember. We'd moved into the northern hemisphere, so outside of the southern hemisphere system. And so we moved at the end of the year, midway through the school year, going into the European school year, which starts in September. So we moved in December. So we took that sort of next 6 or 9 months of schooling, that sort of terms 3 and 4 or 2 and 3. We took that period from January to sort of June to homeschool. And the approach there was we would go to a city and we'd base ourselves for a month in the city. The first thing we would do is sort of brainstorm about the city, and we'd sit as a family group and say, well, what's this city famous for? What are the important things? So what comes to mind is Gaudi and Dali in Barcelona. That was our first full stop. So we sort of, as a group, researched Dali and Gaudi, and then we came up with projects for the kids, and the kids went about those projects. So this is a long way to get to your answer. The first step was we picked an English program and a maths program, which were online programs. So the kids were sort of required to get through a certain schedule in every given week. So we sort of broke down a week into every day, and we said, okay, today you need to do, units 1 to 5 on the online system of maths and English. And then the rest of the day was filled in experiential learning, which resulted in a project for that city. So at their various age group, they chose a theme, sort of whether it was science-based, art-based, history-based, culture-based. So they chose a theme. They went about and learnt about that theme. They applied it to the topic, being Dali or Gaudi. And then at the end of the 4 weeks, they presented it. Our two daughters were sort of moving through their sort of young teenage years, adolescence, I guess, and they very quickly realized that the quicker they got through the sort of taught courses, the more time they had to do the stuff they enjoyed. So they'd get up in the morning, and this was really quite astounding to watch. Two young girls who would get up, prepare their own breakfast. We've got a very strong food culture in the family and eating culture, so sort of eating well and making food and diet and health and nutrition part of your life. So get up, prepare their meals, prepare their workstations, open their computers, do their online courses, and then come back by 10 or 11 o'clock and say, we're done for the day, we're going to go and do X, which was fantastic. They all studied Spanish throughout that program, so that was in person or online, depending on where we were in Europe, and they all did some sort of other activity. So some sort of sport, sort of boxing or some sort of activity, and or art classes or what have you. So generally we'd go somewhere and they'd participate in these. So every then sort of mid-morning to afternoon, they were either doing some sort of activity in a group context, or we were going off as a family and sort of visiting locations and what have you. We'd pack up from that city, and then we'd spend a month traveling and sort of do the same thing. And we'd stop for 3, 4, 5 days. We'd stop somewhere, and then we'd learn about wherever we were going. So, First, Second World War history, for example, visiting museums, visiting sort of all sorts of activities. We did a lot of history, a lot of culture, a lot of language, a lot of sort of fun activities, hiking, boating, surfing, sort of all of these, and a lot of art classes and creativity stuff. So it was a fantastic experience. That got us through till the sort of middle of whatever the year was. And at that point, we then decided to stay and live in Barcelona for sort of no other reason than it was a nice thing to do. So we plonked ourselves in Barcelona and we dropped the kids back into an international schooling system, which really was, for me personally, one of the worst things that we did, because what happened within a month was the kids immediately went from this sort of Bali style, what did I do? What did I learn? Who was I hanging out with? What were my experiences? Transferring that into homeschooling, where they took complete and utter responsibility for their own learning process. By the end of that homeschooling, they were self-learners, lifelong learners. They dropped into the international school, which was an American system, and it immediately put them back into an unbelievably quick timeline. You know, what am I learning? What grades am I getting? I never forget they came home and said, we had a test today and I got grade X. And we said, who cares? We don't care what grade you got. And so that was then sort of indoctrinated into them in very formative years. So we had 2 years in Barcelona again for all sorts of reasons. We moved from Barcelona and moved to Portugal, and we're in Porto. And that education system was that the elder kids were, what's the word? They were earmarked for the International Baccalaureate program. I think one of them maybe had started that journey towards their final 2 years. And so when we moved to Portugal, the decision was entirely about what school offers the IB program. So the decision-making process had really been sort of screwed up by this time, if you like, is that we're now looking for schools that deliver them the IB, because we thought they need that ticket to get to the next stage in life. So we came here, they enrolled into a school, and not sooner had we moved and sort of settled in, let's say 3-6 months into the journey, then the whole COVID hysteria hit, and our school turned into a medical, or an arm of the sort of industrial medical complex, and I took them on aggressively for their foolishness and their lack of foresight into what was very clearly a psychological operation to sort of work out who understands what's happening or not. Long story short, was within 6 months of joining that school, I basically, over the course of the next 6 months, pulled the kids out. That resulted in our eldest daughter graduating out of the IB program, because she basically finished in the same year as the COVID hysteria. So she sort of, as they went home to homeschool, she studied, did exams and left. Our middle daughter was pulled out halfway through her 2-year IB. And so that's a whole nother sort of story we can pursue. So she sort of started year 1 of IB, pulled out and then finished homeschooling. And our son pulled out and has continued to homeschool, and now is, again, the term is no schooling as a 16-year-old, completely sort of running his own agenda. Sorry that took so long, but that's a 20-year journey through, as I say, multiple countries, multiple systems, and sort of multiple directions.
And such a wide variety of through your gallop of telling us what's going on, that there's so many different approaches and experiences that your family had. And so just thinking through as I'm listening to you explain all that, I've got a couple of questions for you. I'm fascinated that it was your children who came to you and said, not only we want to go to Europe, but we want to homeschool. Where did they get that idea from?
So I'll honestly, I forget the sort of the trigger, let's say, sitting somewhere in Bali, but certainly for our 2 daughters, the idea of homeschooling was always very appealing. Our son is he's the youngest, so 2 daughters and a son. Our son is a typical boy who should have been allowed from the youngest of age to be a boy, quite simply. And the entire educational approach to young boys is so totally and fundamentally broken. He should have been out until he was ready to. He should have been out exploring, digging holes, climbing trees, kicking footballs, wrestling with his friends. He should have been doing what boys do, and he should have been encouraged to do that for as long as possible, with as little sort of influence of the system. The Hong Kong schooling system was just disastrous for him. He was a very young boy at the time, but that whole thing was disastrous. When he got to Bali, it was great because it was nicely balanced. He did a lot of that stuff. He did both sort of outdoor activities after school And then within the school framework, it was very sort of play-based and sort of experiential-based learning. Putting him back into the system and homeschooling was very difficult for him because it was sort of apartment living and, so for our son, it was a very, very difficult process. And then putting him back into the sort of formal classroom environment after homeschooling. So sort of after battling with this kid, trying to sort of get him to learn by himself in an apartment building, sort of following let's say, a traditional approach was just a disaster. So homeschooling was difficult. Putting him back into a structured school environment where, told what to do, when to do, how to do it, when to sit, how not to sit. So that whole journey for him was really, really difficult. Our two daughters, on the other hand, are very, very sort of, they're very capable and organized and structured. And the idea of homeschooling for them was always fascinating because they got to choose the sort of direction of their learning. So the sort of Bali education for them they enjoyed because they had this sort of relative freedom and flexibility to pick and choose, but they also had the structure and the guidance to help them sort of in a direction. And so for them, the transition from that sort of relatively flexible Bali system to homeschooling was something that they could easily identify in their own mind, that we could move from this sort of semi-structured system to a fully homeschooling system. And so that they were just open to it. So that was sort of the educational framework for the decision making. The life framework was that Bali is an incredible holiday destination. It's a difficult place to live long term. And I won't get into that, but it's, living in Bali, it's a small island with a pretty small community of people, and it's sort of not particularly international. So here we are with an international family. I was working internationally. The kids traveled with me occasionally, so on and so on. So for the daughters, particularly my wife, it was like we want to move and we want to move somewhere else, which is a bit more international. So the lifestyle decision was let's move. The educational decision was we could homeschool. When you put these two things together, and the sort of the trajectory was Europe for a whole bunch of reasons, without knowing where in Europe, because of course we've got to work out which country do you want to live in, what are the considerations from an immigration and a livability, where can we migrate to and get the residency rights, what are the taxation considerations, what are the considerations for me and my business and traveling around the world and particularly across Asia. So we sort of had to put that basket together. And so that was the sort of life choices. So sort of educationally, sort of family choices, and then the sort of broader life choices that you've got to make around this. We wrapped it all together and said, let's just go without a plan. And how do we do that? The only way to go without a plan is to have flexibility on the education front. So that was the decision-making process. And mum and dad are talking about what are the sort of lifestyle considerations, as I say, the sort of migration, residency, taxation, business, sort of living, cost of living. We're talking these things. Our kids, on the other hand, are saying, well, we don't care about all those things. Here's the solution. Let's just go and be footloose and fancy free, and you can educate us through homeschooling. So I guess it's a long way to dribble out that the kids saw the solution to a complex problem, that solution being flexibility, and the flexibility being through homeschooling.
Mm-hmm. Do you think you found it, well, tell me what the transition was like, moving through the school system and then suddenly deciding to homeschool. Were you aware at the time, yourself and your wife, that you had to work through some, any kind of intellectual or emotional considerations? Because it's quite a different thing because now you're not delegating anymore. You're taking on responsibility. So that means you've got to change the way you're thinking about it. Were you aware, first of all, that you were working through that, or was it more kind of, okay, kids, we're going to do this and see how it goes?
The cognizant decision at the time was that maths and English were important, right? So the kids needed to sort of get their foundations in that, and that everything else was experiential. Yeah. So there's a couple of things that were cognizant around those decisions. Firstly was that they're all individual. So we were very, very clear by this stage in our education. I mean, we were right from the very youngest of age, in fact, but what was very, very important that our kids were all different and they're individuals. And so therefore and what we enjoyed about the bar learning system was that it encouraged that individual learning approach. So that was a very easy decision. So with the framework of we'll have a structured English and maths program and everything else is fluid, and all that matters is that they come out of this with an incredible range of experiences. So that was sort of easy for us. What we didn't do, again, what we were cognizant of very, very clearly was not to be constrained by a loss in so-called knowledge within the framework of a fixed system. Let me say that another way. We didn't care that the kids would not necessarily be at the markers that they needed to be at the end of this journey. We said what was more important, that they picked up a whole range of skills, experiences, and sort of enjoyed the journey. So at no point during this thing did we say, oh, what about that? So I remember this very specifically. We spoke to their science teacher when we left Bali. He was sort of very critical to say, science is important. You've got to build science. You've got to do this, this, and this in science. And he gave us a big stack of work to do. We sort of took that on board. We got over to our first stop we stopped in Paris first, then to Barcelona, and we got there and we looked at all this stuff and we just said, no, scrap it. We can't do science. It's crazy. What we can do is visit science sort of museums, and we can go and experience things and sort of reflect on it from a science perspective. But we're not going to go and try and teach these kids scientific method. So again, that's sort of a long way to say that what we were very, very focused on was that it was the journey that would provide them the learning experience, and that journey, and making the most of everything we did. Making sure we got to the museums, making sure we got to the cultural sort of iconic locations, making sure we looked at history, making sure we looked at sort of the places we were in and experiencing, going to the beach, just simple things, and reflecting. We had a period where I think it was daily, and then we moved to weekly, where we'd sit down at a lunch or something, and we'd say, okay, go around the table and tell 3 things that you observed today. It's not what you learned, but what you observed. So the kids would tell us their observations of the day. I saw this, or I saw that, or I noticed this. And then that was a form of discussion. So we spent a lot of time doing that. So again, key point here is that what we learnt became irrelevant, and the journey of experiences and the joy of, or the curiosity of learning became the priority.
Which is, as you found out, a perfectly valid form of education. It makes me smile when you've got the story of the science teacher who kitted you out with this, here, learn this science, without actually himself understanding that there's so much science. You're just kind of going around this way to learn your science, but ultimately your children were going to end up at the same place and knowing their science, but they'd done it in a heck of a lot more of an interesting way.
Well, Kristen, I'd actually take a different view from that, where I am at the moment. And again, so what's interesting in this sort of learning curve is that mum and dad go through the learning curve in an equally sort of strong way as what the kids do. For me personally, if you look at education and the purpose of education, you just sort of say, here we have these sort of moldable sort of young brains as whatever at birth age through to somewhere in their 20s over this 25 or whatever year period. The what you learn, the knowledge base and the content, I would say I would actually go as far to say it's completely irrelevant, particularly today. The what you learn is completely irrelevant. And how could I say that what you learn is irrelevant? It's because the bucket of information that we all have available to us is so vast. I mean, the what in any given subject matter is just simply so vast that we could never learn it all.
True.
And so therefore the how becomes important, the how you learn. And this is where I think the entire education system has been completely corrupted, that focuses on the what of somebody telling the student the what they must learn, and then you overlay that with when they must learn and how you must learn it. To me, that's the corruption of the education system. If you strip it all away and you say, well, we have a bucket of knowledge that we can learn, let's throw the kids in the bucket and let them learn the process of learning, reflect on the process of learning, learn the things that inspire them, learn the things that interest them, that challenge them, that, if we just let go of the reins and let kids go through this journey on their own, maybe they never learn science. Who cares? I mean, how many adults use the science they learn at school today? Those that are interested in science. Maths is the same, English is the same, Spanish is the same, history is the same, and the list goes on. So I really take this sort of strong view now, and it's been shaped by this journey that we should be focusing on letting our kids learn the process of learning, learn the how, and reflect on that, and take completely away any focus on the what and the knowledge component. Let the kids enjoy that journey of the what. Let them discover and delve down. Essentially putting the guardrails in place to say, hey, kids, the world is your oyster. Go and learn it as you please. We'll simply make sure that the bumpers keep you in the lane, using a sort of an analogy to the bowling, 10-pin bowling. So,
yeah. And I think when you transition through that way of thinking, and I mean, to be fair, that teaching what to think and filling your kids up at a certain time and measuring it by grades, that's what we all grew up in. So that's our own expectation. And it's quite a mind shift to have the courage to make changes to that, because you're dealing with these precious children, and the last thing you want to do as parents is stuff your kids up. So it does take an element of courage and faith to do that. And I think the key you mentioned a little bit, a little while ago, Andrew, just a few minutes back. Oh dear, it's just going from me. The lifelong learners. That's the one I wanted to return to, because at what point did that become the goal of your wife and yourself, when you realize, because your wife's a teacher, she's taught in the orthodox teaching method. At what point did your growing awareness come when you changed from teaching what and when to, we want to make lifelong learners here, because education doesn't stop when they graduate, it's lifelong. So have you got any comments about noticing how you changed through that?
yeah, absolutely. So within this sort of private membership group that I'm part of, we talk about the sort of the awareness curve, or the awakening curve, or the enlightenment curve. I mean, pick any one of those sort of phrases, but it's the learning curve through a process to become more enlightened, more awakened, more aware. And so the first stage of that was this shift from Bali to homeschooling and then into the system again, where I became very, very vocal. We were in Barcelona in the sort of American system for 2 full school years. So they were academic years, Northern Hemisphere, September through to June each year. So we did 2 of those 4 years. All 3 started in an international school. 2 of the 3 after year 1, we pulled out and pushed them into a local school because we were so disappointed with the international school. The local school was worse than the international school. So one of them went back into the international school. The other our youngest stayed in the local school. That was the very first dawning of me of a real awareness that the system is so totally broken, that the system doesn't care about the individual. It doesn't care about the process of learning. It doesn't care about giving these kids responsibilities, all of which they just learnt themselves for 2 or 3 years in their own journey. As I say, homeschooling in the European sort of 6-month, 9-month period, and the Balinese system. These skills of sort of self-responsibility, self-learning, self-motivation, sort of all of those were thrown out of the window, and the system gave them a framework and a structure and a what and a grading system to ensure they complied. they were immediately put into a social context that said they have to fit in, that there's this band, and they entered the system at the low end of the band because they hadn't been in the system, and so automatically they were socially and peer pressured to sort of push up through the band so that their grades would get higher and higher, so they become more socially acceptable. I mean, I could see it so clearly, and I became really frustrated and angered by it. And I don't know when in that 2-year period, but somewhere along the line, all I spoke about was building a school of the future. And I called it SOFL, School of the Future. um, which, I mean, the kids would sit there and listen to me garble on about how rotten the system was. So they're within the system, trying to conform socially, trying to keep up with the grades, sort of looking for the ticket, which was I think it was the A-level system, which would give them the ticket to get into their international baccalaureate. So they're sort of searching and screaming to be in the system, and dad's at home sort of screaming at them, saying that I use the word screaming, I shouldn't, but I'm sort of pushing this worldview that the system is so utterly broken. Remember back to when, focus on the what, and focus on the learning process, focus on being independent, all of these sort of generic terms. Meanwhile, mum's sort of sitting in between, as you say, with a sort of very traditional sort of educational background, having been through the homeschooling and taking the approach of, I've still got a responsibility to sort of load my kids up with knowledge, and so, but I can see that there's a better way to do it. So I'm sort of one end out in the curve, the kids are in the middle of the system, and mum's halfway through the curve, if you like. So again, this is a long way to answer. Was there a moment? Yes, we all went through this process. Moving from Barcelona to Porto was a very difficult process because, as I said, socially, we then had to sort of strip these teenage girls particularly out of, well, actually, let me just go back a step. For our son, what was interesting there, we stripped him out of the international school into a sort of a semi-local international school. But the key point there was that he spent one full school year. We felt his school year in the international school was a complete waste of time. I mean, he basically learnt nothing and was frustrated continually at everything. Just was bored, was frustrated. Teacher calling us in. He wasn't a naughty kid. He just was bored and frustrated. So we put him into the local school, and we said, basically, we don't really care whether he learns anything. So knowledge is not the goal here. What we care about is Spanish language mastering and learning the skill to adapt. So he was thrown into an environment with local Spanish kids. He played rugby with local Spanish kids. The playground was entirely 100% Spanish, and 50% of the curriculum was in Spanish. The other 50% was in English. Everyone in the curriculum department, so it was maths, that taught in Spanish spoke Spanish. So the maths teacher spoke Spanish all day. If you're in an English curriculum, the English subject, or history was in English, all of that department spoke English. So basically, our young boy had to battle this system and learn to adapt and fit in. The first 3 months was horrible. Lots of tears, lots of anger and frustration, what have you. But he came out the end of it and spoke Spanish fluently, made a bunch of really cool friends. And the end of the journey was that he learnt resilience. He learnt the process of learning for himself. He learnt Spanish language, which lives with him today. So again, here's a decision that we made where we said the content doesn't matter. We've got a different objective for this sort of 1 year period. So really interesting challenge. So then we moved to Portugal, and as I say, we sort of fitted in, and the key priority in our first 6 months here was all that matters is getting our 2 daughters to fit in socially. We'd done the same thing. We'd come, we'd visited, we'd made the sort of group decision, the family decision, which I'll be honest, sort of the wife and the 2 daughters were not particularly happy about the decision. That was the first decision that we'd made, that there wasn't sort of uniformity, but we came regardless, and everyone was sort of content and committed to making this choice. So we said, okay, what's the decision here? The decision is to socially integrate into the community. We all dived headfirst and said, what we're going to do is be socially sort of relevant. We're going to fit in, and we're going to have friends, and that's all that matters for the sort of first term of school life, even though our eldest was in her IB and our second was a year away from IB. So we said, let's forget about that and let's be social. And then, as I say, the COVID hysteria hit. The school took the first thing they did was kick us all home to sort of homeschool, which our three kids went, yeah, couldn't have been happier. Literally happiest kids in the school because they knew how to homeschool. They knew what it meant. They didn't particularly like the school or the culture within the school. It's a whole nother sort of set of. You got kids who have been through 7 cities, 10 schools, 5 systems. They got to this school and they said immediately, we don't fit in here, which is a really interesting dynamic into itself. So, in other words, kids that are highly adaptable that got to a school that didn't fit in. Interesting. And so when the homeschooling stint finished, the summer holidays came, and then they basically implemented a sort of a health department approach to the schooling system, which is when I took it on entirely. And then by the end of that 2020 sort of calendar year, halfway through the 2021 school year, I pulled all 3 kids out effectively. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think the summary would be is that the learning curve for mum and dad through this process, I guess I was further along the curve that the education system's broken and we need to take a different approach to mum. Mum has followed in a similar curve, and not necessarily saying it's the right curve, but we're both now very, very sort of uniform to say that the system is framed around the what. The system removes any sense of individuality, and the system determines the process of learning. In other words, the time you start, the time you finish, the rules and the framework by which you live in. So mum and dad both had a very common approach to say, well, that system is wrong. And what should be front and center is the kid's individuality and getting the kid to sort of drive this learning process together. That has been, I guess, the outcome of 20 years. If only we were sort of here 20 years ago, maybe it was a different approach, who knows? But that's where we are now. So our son is homeschooled. Our son is no school.
Yes.
And I'll pull up there and sort of give you a moment because again, I've sort of hogged the microphone.
This is the intention of it, where I just want you to download, and I will punctuate with questions and things that I want to have included. But because I'm listening to things that are important to yourself and your wife and your family, and you've used the word culture a few times. And I guess when you're a traveling family, strengths of family relationships become even more important than if you are remaining in a home culture where it often turns out to the opposite, quite fragmented in a family culture. So you mentioned your family culture, that you clearly have worked very hard on that. You mentioned food culture. I would like to hear if any of that ventured into your educational approach as well. And what else do you think was really important to yourself and your wife as you're bringing up your children, including their education?
Well, so again, I would give 100% credit to my wife for this, that the number one thing in our life for the last 20 years has been our family. And so therefore the nucleus of 5 of us. And so, as you've rightly identified, moving so regularly, both within Australia and internationally, but particularly internationally, you have fractured, let's say, relationships at best. They're both within sort of wife and my own sort of nuclear families. It's difficult to maintain relationships when you haven't seen people for very long periods of time. And so then on top of that, you have, and so sort of the idea around sort of growing up with your nuclear family, mine, for example, or my wife's mum, dad, brother. And then what typically happens is you then have all the cousins and the aunties and the uncles. And so my wife's family, it comes from a sort of a European sort of Spanish, Italian type heritage. So very big families. And so that sort of that whole family thing disappears out of your life. Even for me, I sort of grew up with, I think it was weekly dinners at grandma's, and then it was sort of monthly get-togethers, and twice or 3 times a year the whole family, sort of the cousins and the uncles and aunties and everyone would get together. That was all gone. So the nuclear family became priority number 1. And again, with 100% credit to my wife, You mentioned food. So food and eating is very much part of our life. So learning to cook, cooking together, sort of experiencing food together and the food culture where we travel. So eating out and bringing what we eat out into the home, sort of learning to cook, cooking schools. We've done sort of day-long or multi-day things in multiple times in Italy, across Portugal, across Spain, in Hong Kong, in Thailand, in Malaysia. So, bringing food and then, as I say, bringing that culture, bringing it back into the home. The really nice sort of happy story of that is our daughter's currently studying in Madrid at Le Cordon Bleu, which is a sort of a famous cookery school. So she's about to graduate at the end of this year as a patisserie chef. And in her sort of resume, she writes that the key driver of that sort of love of cooking, but particularly pastry work, was being the sort of family baker. And so from a young age, she would bake. Again, the traditions. Christmas is incredibly important. Again, 100% credit to my wife, but she's created this incredible tradition around our family Christmas. So we grew up as a family Christmas where it was one day at one family, another day at the other family, and there's sort of big family events with all the cousins and aunties and uncles, and then little traditions with some friends from neighbours coming over from next door. Our family tradition is the 5 of us doing something on Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and Boxing Day. And we built this, and we put up the tree, and we do it from sort of whatever the 20 days pre-Christmas. So a lot of these really strong family traditions. So that they're all part of our family culture. Again, as the sort of COVID hysteria hit, it couldn't have sort of come at a better time. We had these easily sort of moldable teenage kids, let's say, who were very now fortunate they had a strong family nucleus to guide them through that period of time. So they didn't have the influence of, say, social networks or peer networks. So everyone had a very difficult time through the COVID and whatever experience they went through. Again, for us, it was very sort of positive outcome, but that we're in a new city, in a new country, that we had sort of been rejected because of my approach to the local community about what I saw as a failure of everything. So we were very fortunate. We had a very strong family. And so sort of, let's say, in some respects, that hysteria didn't impact us because we were a close family. So we just did our thing. Go on a family walk together. We cooked barbecues at home together. We just did our thing as a family. So yeah, I think that answers your question. I hope that answers your question.
It does. That's really good. And I think it's a good place to just park for a little while. And because what you've just talked about is advice in itself to other families who are wanting to travel and incorporate culture and their education. And I'd like you, as you reflect over your years and coming out the side of the kids' education, what advice would you give to other families who literally want to make the world as their classroom?
Look, in fact, you and I have sort of touched on this previously, haven't we? I think the number one thing it's a complete change in mindset that education, the education system as we know it for the last 3 generations, is a broken system. And what's broken about it is the confines that the system puts on education. The confines being the framework by how you learn. In other words, the rigid timetable of start times, lesson times, start and finish, bells ringing, the rules that are incorporated into the classroom setting, putting up your hands, can I go to the toilet, cannot go to the toilet, the rules that are put around what you learn, what is right, what is wrong, this idea of critical thinking, the idea that they teach children critical thinking. Children don't need to be taught critical thinking. They just need to have their mind opened and not closed. And the system closes their mind and then tells them to think critically. The system says, go and answer this question and think critically, and then they give them a grade on whether they answered it right or wrong. I mean, it's a complete and utter. So this is a long sort of critique of the system.
Yeah.
But the number one thing that you have to get your head around is letting your kids start as young as possible and drive the journey to being lifelong learners. Kids are curious, and they are right through. We still are today. We're naturally curious. We naturally want to dive in and learn things. Let them do it, because it does not matter In my strong opinion, after doing all this stuff, it does not matter the system designed grade that is assigned to these kids at various points through their life. That simply doesn't matter. Well, let me say that another way. The system will tell you your kids need a certain number to pass or fail a certain topic at various stages through their education. That number is irrelevant. If your kid has a passion and if they have a desire and they have the right framework to learn, they will prepare themselves to learn that through life, and they will get to where they want to be in the journey. And the system-derived numbers that they've got to get, the system-derived ticket that they've got to pick up to transfer through to the next stage of life is a complete and utter fallacy. It's a lie, it's a fraud, and it's system-generated.
Do you mean, are you talking like a degree?
I'm saying that if your kid ends up, if the ultimate journey, well, let's zoom right out here. When in doubt, zoom out. What do we want from our kids? We effectively want them to be, able to make good, sound decisions in their life. We want them to be ideally financially independent of the system. And we want them to have a lifelong approach to learning, let's say. For me, they're three sort of goals. Independent financial means or independent of the system, the ability to learn continually through life, the ability to make choices on their own. So if that's what you're looking for, what we want to do is give kids the journey to enable them to be that person. And what I'm saying is that the system is built around giving our children a ticket to pass from one system to the next system. So that ticket is in the education system there by grades. So the British education system, arguably the worst. They have the Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, Key Stage 3. So they're basically saying that at a certain age, you must be able to tick the boxes to pass this key stage. A complete and utter fallacy. You must be able to pass the next key stage at another age barrier, and so on, until you get to your Form 10, where you've got to have a school certificate, A-levels, a IGCSE, call it what you like, through to year 12, where you have your international baccalaureate or any other degree that's equivalent to that. Through each of these tickets allow you to pass through the gates to go to the next stage, to go to university, which allow you then to get the ticket to go through to the next stage. And what ultimately does that entire system train you to be? It trains you to be system-oriented robots to go into a corporate career structure. It basically says, we have now trained you and you've got a grade and a score, and based on the grade and your score at a global level, we'll determine which job you can go into. So you've now been pigeonholed into one of 150 different careers. You're a doctor, you're a lawyer, you're an engineer, you're a finance guy, you're whatever you may be. We'll determine which of the premier employers get to take their pick of you. So the biggest companies will take their pick from the best schools and the best grades, and the second tier companies from the next grade of schools and the next grade of kids, and so on and so on and so on. And out at the end of the journey, you'll have a job in a system which is telling you what to produce within a very tight framework, when to produce it. So again, I may be speaking in riddles here, but if you want to build an education system for your kids that put them into a structure and a system which robots them to a fixed salary, to a fixed career, to a fixed path, which ultimately puts them into the sort of debt slavery system. What is the debt slavery system? It's working for a corporation, working sort of 9 to 5, being asked to work overtime for no extra payment, to which you then can pay an exorbitant amount of money in tax, to which you can then go and buy a car and put it on loan, to which you can pay more money out to the system, which is the banking system, to which you can then save to buy a house, which you can then be in the debt system to pay more money back to the banking system. And if you want that for your child, then sure, stay in the traditional education system. if you want to create kids, if you want to provide for your kids a framework where they reject that system entirely and they say, we're going to live outside the system in whatever that looks like, then escape it early, is what I'm saying. Escape it early, because the entire system, from the age you put them in at 4 years of age till the age you get put in a box at 70, whatever years of age, is designed around extracting as much wealth from the individual as you possibly can through taxation, through inflation, through interests, the entire system. So step outside of that system as early as possible and teach your kids to be completely independent of the system.
Mm. And can I just say that for all of these people now listening to this, you have just been handed a little box of gems. So go back to where Andrew starts talking about the advice that he gives for those wanting to make the world of their classroom, and put that on a loop and just play it and listen to it for as long as it takes you to gently start to dismantle your traditional view of the way you do life. And it's not an easy thing, is it, Andrew, to have to dismantle what you've always taken for granted. It can be quite a destabilizing process. So it's a little bit like a grief process for some people, I think, too. You know, there's that denial, there's the anger, and then there's the acceptance. So a measure of grace for yourself to just give it the time that it takes to work your way through that. So
Look, Christine, it's unbelievably challenging, and I know people will be sitting there and say that's fine for him to say he ran his own business and sort of was independently mobile, and it's exactly right. I had lots of fortunes through my life, and I was able to run and set up my own business, and was financially secure through this journey. And I guess there'd be two things to consider here. One is firstly a recognition that if the debt-based slavery system, and that sounds like an extreme term to use, but if you're living in middle-class Western society, and arguably in most societies around the world, but I'll give you a very clear analogy. I went to the UK a few years ago and we stayed in sort of suburban London. It was about half an hour, 40 minutes out of the centre of London. And all I saw was a debt-based slavery system. Why? Because we had these rows upon rows of terrace houses. They were lovely, all of them renovated, all of them beautifully built. This is middle Australia, suburban Sydney, it's suburban Auckland, it's any city around the world. Lovely homes. They're probably £300,000 or £400,000 each. All of them would be mortgaged at 60, 70 or 80%. Every one of these homes had 1, 2 or 3 late model cars, most of the Europeans. So we're talking BMWs, Mercedes, Lexus, lovely cars. Most of these homes well kept and well maintained. Most of these homes with the recent renovations, external and internal. You're talking mum and dad working 2 jobs, almost so one job each. Almost certainly a large percentage of them working another job in another way, whether it's an Airbnb home or they're driving Ubers or whatever the gig economy provides them. So 2 parents working their butts off, working almost certainly in a commuting type context. So again, I'm walking through this suburb at 6, 7 in the morning, walking the dog, and I'm seeing everyone pouring out of their homes off to work. So 6, 7 a.m. off they go to work. They get into their job at 8 a.m. They work till 5 or 6 p.m. They commute back home again, potentially running a second job or a second business or whatever that may be. Those 2 parents are so focused on maintaining the illusion of their life. And what is their life? They earn X number of dollars. Pick a number, it's 100,000 a year. Automatically, almost half of that goes to the government in the form of taxes. So the 100K a year they earn in one way or another, whether that's direct income tax, whether that's a tax on their bonuses, whether that's the NHS subscription that they pay, whether that's a capital gain tax on their property, you know, the list goes on. The fuel excise tax, the goods and services tax, about half of the 100 goes into taxation. So then they've got 50 grand to spend. They're mortgaged to the hilt because they want to keep up with the Joneses and have as good a home as they possibly can. So they're mortgaged to the hilt. So then another quarter of that money, or half of what's left, goes to paying interest to the mortgage to repay this loan. They end up with a quarter of their salary on expenses, and that then goes into food, living, and educating their children, because their children are going to go to a good school, so they pay for their good school. What's left at the end of it is a few pennies that they maybe put away for whatever, for a holiday to the south of Spain or something like that. What am I describing here? I'm talking about a debt slavery system where these people get on on a sort of a rat run, and they run as fast as they can to stay within the confines of the system, to own a nice home, to own nice cars, to have their kids in the system, but they don't spend any quality time as a family. They don't spend any quality time with their kids. If that is the life that you think is acceptable, if that's the life you want for your kids, then stay in the system. If you recognize that that is a problem, get out of the system. How do you do it? That's a whole other podcast, right? How do you do it? I don't know. But what you can do, what the first obligation for yourself, and this is a long way to get to your answer to your question, recognize that system is designed by purpose to keep you enslaved within the system. And as soon as you recognize that, as soon as you recognize that the educational framework that we've grown up with for 2 or 3 generations is by design, the sooner you can free your mind to escape that system and get your kids out of it as quick as possible and let them on a journey of discovery and exploring and unlimited opportunities that they could never, ever find while ever they're in the system.
Mm-hmm. It's scary, but it's fantastically exciting, and it just brings freedom. I remember when we started to, well, basically the scales start to drop from your eyes, and I think for your own mental health, it needs to happen gradually. But when it does start to, I can remember it was like utter astonishment that we had been so taken in, and then as you start to rebuild and reshape and you're stepping back and pivoting and you're going elsewhere, it's quite, because now you have to leave in a certain extent the way most of your peers and family and friends are doing things. That's also something to be taking into account, is that you do need to find your like-minded people in your community that are going to
100%.
support you in these really important life decisions that you're remaking.
Yeah, look, Christine, again, I know we're sort of really racing over time, but it's such an important consideration is that what we're talking about right now over the last 10 or 15 minutes, it's a huge decision that families need to make, is whether they want to be in the system. As soon as they say they don't want to be in the system, they will be pariahs. Again, think all of the major events of the last 5, 6, 7, 10 years. You say that COVID was an event of historical proportions, and you question the mainstream narrative. Well, you get ostracized as an individual. You go and question the Ukrainian war situation, you're ostracized. You go and question the Israeli situation, you're ostracized. The decision that parents have to make is, are they prepared to be ostracized from their families and from their friends and from their existing social networks by saying, you know what, I'm going to exit the system. And again, the idea of I'm going to homeschool my kids and simply change the location by which the system is going to indoctrinate me. In other words, I'm going to move it from the schoolyard to the home, but follow the same systemic approach. You're not homeschooling your kids. So it's a system-wide change. It's a structural change that's got to be made in the family. It's a completely different approach to life, and be totally and utterly prepared that you'll be ostracized from community, and everyone who you speak to will think you've lost the plot. And as you say, that's a slow decision. That happened for us gradually, fortunately. We heard it first when we left Australia for Hong Kong. Like, why would you do that? We then heard it again. And what about your family? And when are you coming back? And all these sorts of questions. And then from Hong Kong to Bali, like, what? You're going to go and be hippies in Bali? Then from Bali to homeschooling, what? You don't want to do to educate your kids anymore? So through each of these decisions, we sort of got a little taste of being ostracized. We've always been slightly unusual and abnormal, if you like. But again, if you, it doesn't matter where you are in the curve, recognize that you've got to leave the system and you've got to completely flip your mind. Great book called 180 Degrees. Flip your mind 180 degrees and look at where you want yourself to be and where you want your kids to be at 5, 10, 20 years into the future. And that's rejecting the framework of the system that's in front of you.
All right. So my last question for you, Andrew, and I think you've dipped your toes into it every so often over this last hour or so, is that if you could time travel and go back to your young Andrew self, just getting married, just starting with the kids, and you got to visit with yourself as a more mature gentleman, what advice would you give yourself?
Oh, that's difficult. Firstly, my first answer is a non-answer, and that is that my wife and I have been very cognizant throughout our entire journey of not have regrets. Whenever we delve into the "I wish we had," we both pull each other up to say, let's not live in a life of regrets. With that in mind, there's one decision that I made. There's one decision that I do regret in the entire journey that people, if they remember, and that decision was going back into the schooling system in Barcelona. So again, very, very clear as a husband and wife, we've been very clear, let's not have regrets, but I regret that decision. With that exception, I wouldn't have necessarily done things any differently. In other words, the idea that my wife made a decision and we both supported 100% that decision for her to be a stay-at-home mum and to embrace that in entirety, not just I want to stay at home, but the entirety of what that meant. She cooks meals for us. She's content to be a mother of our children. She's content to be a wife of her husband. She's content to pursue and support everything that means. That decision and the choices that we made, I wouldn't change in any way. And again, part of that decision, she brought those decisions into our life. She brought in the food and the sort of healthy eating and the sort of, we haven't touched on it, but the disregard for and the rejection of the sort of medical industrial complex. And so all of these decisions were brought into our life. So I wouldn't change any of those things. They've been fantastic. For me personally, probably I would have taken a more active role. I mean, if I could take what's in my brain now and apply it to me as a 25-year-old, 28-year-old, when we had kids, I would have had a more active involvement in the kids' life. It would be, my view was always that, and maybe this view doesn't change, but I remember thinking that the younger educational framework doesn't matter for kids. That was always my worldview, and my wife's worldview was it's the most important, it's the foundational phases. I think we were probably both right in that we were looking at that situation for young kids. We're talking sort of preschool to sort of 12, sort of the 4 to 12-year-old age groups. My view was this doesn't matter. All that matters is the high school years and sort of getting your ticket at the end. In other words, my worldview was based on looking at the system and saying to the system, it didn't matter what you learned as a young kid. What mattered was what you would learn as an older kid. My wife's worldview was that the foundations are built in the young years and those foundations need to be put in place for the older years. If we look at those same two views now, I think we were both correct, but we would apply it in a different way. In other words, it doesn't matter what you learn as a young kid. In other words, reject the system, forget what you learn as a young kid. And for my wife, the foundations matter because she built those foundations outside of the school system, which was, trust in parents, trust in the direction, trust in each other, trust in the sort of process of learning and sort of being inquisitive and what have you. She brought all of those things into the home every day. So again, I think we're both right. So again, a bit of a waffling answer to say I wouldn't necessarily change anything. What I would do is take a more active role in the kids' education, rather than sort of leaving it all to mum. And the one regret that I carry to this day was putting the kids back into the system after having 2 years in Bali and a year effectively homeschooling, after sort of rejecting the system and embracing everything that a sort of a freer lifestyle gave. We dropped our kids straight back into the system, and it was tough. It was a bad decision. I would say that to this day.
I know it's hard to look back and realize that if you could have gone back and done it again, you would have done something. But it is what it is too, and no doubt you've been able to talk this through with your children as well. It doesn't do your children any harm at all to know that their parents could have done things differently, but that was the way it was at the time.
Let me try and finish this though with a real positive on where my kids are. So my oldest daughter is at university studying. She is doing a digital marketing degree. I think the reality is that our three kids, but for the two elder ones, they've got a foot in both camp. In other words, she's doing the digital marketing degree with the purpose that she'll get a degree out of this. She's sort of 2 years into 3, so she has less than 6 months to finish. So she's committed to finishing that, having the certificate, and sort of I got something at the end of it. But the foot that's in the other camp is very, very firmly of the understanding that she's out pursuing entrepreneurial activities every day of her life. She's having very clear and open discussions around how she manages her location for her company and herself personally, to manage her tax position as she goes through life, because she wants to retain as much as what she earns, which is as much as her productive output as she possibly can. So she's sort of foot in the camp of sort of understanding that she's in a system and she wants a ticket. I think that's more about a reward-based system for her personally, but very clearly I'm recognizing the system is broken and she wants to pursue something of her own choosing and something in her own direction. So I'm really happy and excited for her. My second daughter has again gone into university, left the university system, and now studying this patisserie chef course. She'll graduate as a patisserie chef, and super excited about the opportunities that brings her, because she has a skill. And so we talk all the time about skills and experiences. And we're saying to her now, go out and get some work experience, and don't just get a job and stay in a company forever, but use the next 2 or 3 years to work in different countries, in different size companies, in different sort of career options, to build as many skills as you can. She's already talking about that. She's talking about going down to Buenos Aires to do some work experience. She's studying in Madrid, so potentially doing another internship in either Madrid or Barcelona. So she's already sort of on this path of saying, let's build out as many experiences as we can. And our son is 16 going on 17. He's going to his final 2 years of school. He's in the American system, which is a credit-based system. But the credit-based system, he's able to basically choose his learning on any given topic and apply it to the topic. Basically, it's a tick the box type mechanism for him to get a certificate at the end. So again, we're still in the system, so he gets a certificate, but everything he learns, he applies it. So he's just spent 4 weeks down in the south of Spain, sort of hanging out with some buddies, if you like, and they camped, they hunted, they fished, they camped overnight, five places. They did a whole bunch of survivalist skills. That's a subject, so he'll apply all of that learning into their learning model, and he'll come out and tick the box, and that's another subject. His maths, in the next year, he'll run an Excel program. So he's doing Excel training. So his maths course will be learning how to use Excel. His business studies, he's going to do 2 years sort of shadowing me in the business and the activities I'm involved in. So that'll be 2 credits over 2 years studying business, which basically is shadowing me. His language, we're going to spend quite a bit of time in Latin America. So his language will be sort of Spanish language, but it'll be applied. So he'll actually go and do things. I've got work experience lined up for him. So again, we've got 3 kids that'll exit the system very much out of the system. So I guess we've achieved our objectives, regardless of the journey and some of the choices we made through the journey. So again, I have to very strongly say I wouldn't necessarily change anything we did.
That's a wonderful place to stop. Yeah, I love it. Andrew, thank you so much for your time. I just know listeners are going to appreciate your honesty, your experience, and just your generous download of life. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Christine. It's been a pleasure. Sorry it ran a little longer than we'd planned, and I hope everyone enjoys it. Thank you very much.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you indeed.